So I'm going to try to do this quickly. And World War One is kind of a big concept, but because our focus is on women's history, I don't know that we have to dig really hard into all the nuts and bolts. So it's going to be kind of challenging for me because first off, I typically teach World War One kind of as a whole thing, and so to try to scale back. So that's going to be. So I'm going to try to keep this short and simple. You guys can look through the slides. The slides pretty much give you the basic information just by reading it, but I'm going to kind of try to point out some key points as we move through. So the first thing I want to point out is in 1914, by the time you get to 1914, we've gone through Roosevelt's corollary, we've gone through Taft's dollar diplomacy, and President Wilson has now taken over. Now, Wilson tries to say that he wants to have a different approach towards foreign policy, but unfortunately, the financial investment in other countries keeps pulling the United States into conflict. And it's not helped by the fact that Wilson is really kind of full of himself. He thinks that the United States is perfect and that, we need to teach the world, we need to set this global example. So when other countries like Mexico, which is in the midst of a revolution in the early 1900s, or Nicaragua, Haiti, Dominican Republic, that have some uprisings, particularly against American investment, you're going to have Wilson sending troops in. In fact, we send troops all the way into Mexico City. We occupy the city of Veracruz, largely chasing after Pancho Villa, right? So you have Wilson, who says he doesn't want to be globally. He doesn't want to have that kind of military involvement anymore, but yet that's actually what he's doing. And so you have the U.S. still kind of sticking its nose in other countries, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. Now, in Europe, you have this industrialization, which I misspelled industrialization, and nationalism that are part of what I mentioned when we talked about imperialism, this idea of independence movements, lots of social classes. And so that is a founding a basic factor. You've got conflicts and alliances as well. This imperialism, a lot of these European countries had gone into Africa, they had gone into Asia, and had defeated, people, tribes, groups, countries that were less developed in industrialization. So, of course, the European powers, because they have bigger guns, put it pretty simply, they're taking over these countries. This is where you have, the domination of South Africa, that kind of thing. You did have one conflict in Europe called the Franco-Prussian War. Because we're not a world history class, we won't go into the Franco-Prussian War, but it does lead to a lot of bad feelings between Germany and France. And the outcome of the Franco-Prussian War is going to be a set of alliances where France and Russia are allied against each other. Germany and Austria-Hungary are allied together. Britain and Belgium are allied together. And so you've got this delicate balance of power after the Franco-Prussian War. And the idea is, we don't want to trigger a conflict, right? We don't want war to happen. And so they have, they're constantly, the way I always describe this, think about a high school lunchroom, right? Where you've got this table that has this clique and that table that has that clique. And they agree not that they're going to have each other's backs. And because you can't pick on one of them without picking on the other one, you tend to not get into fights, right? But this is made complicated once you have militarism, once Mahan's naval theory and all this imperialism. Plus, when you have a national identity, it's like having a team, right? You want to be able to cheer for your team. So let's cheer for our military. Our guys are great, right? So the militarism, along with the alliances, the nationalism, and all this kind of industrialization and kind of interference in other countries is going to lead to a lot of bad feelings. And so ultimately, what will happen in 1914 is the assassination of the Austrian Archduke, and he will be killed in Sarajevo. Austria-Hungary was an old empire that had controlled Serbia, and Serbia had been advocating for its independence. There had been some terrorist activities, and so you basically have Austria the Archduke's doing a goodwill tour and gets shot in the process. And Austria is pretty upset about this. Obviously, they want to invade Serbia. Russia comes in and they say, well, we don't want you to attack Serbia. They're culturally a lot more like us. Like, we don't think it's right. You should be giving them their independence. And so Austria knows that Russia kind of supports Serbia. So Austria turns to Germany. Germany then says, okay, Russia, you stay out of this. And we're going to back Austria to go pick on Serbia. So then Russia wants to do something, and because Germany knows Russia's going to get involved, they preemptively attack France. So this pulls France into it. And if you're thinking, what the heck, this is confusing, you're right, it is. It's like a gigantic, like it's high school drama is what it is. You picked on my friend, so I'm going to pick on you, and all that kind of stuff, right? And so it just doesn't make any sense. And so you can kind of see how we end up with this kind of global conflict. Your allies are going to be France, Russia, Great Britain, and Italy. Italy's a little bit late to the game in World War I, but they do eventually come in on the side of the Allies. Great Britain comes in because the attack by Germany on France went through Belgium, and of course Belgium was kind of like their little brother, and so they were going to protect Belgium. So you have those allies against the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria, and ultimately you end up with a two-front war. So this kind of gives you an idea. Here's Serbia, right? Here's Austria-Hungary. So the Archduke was on a tour there. So he gets assassinated, and so they're going to invade that. Russia says, no, we want to protect Serbia. And so that's how you end up with this whole thing happening. So Germany knows that Russia is likely to get involved, so sweep through Belgium, and then you have a two-front war, one front here and one front over here. So kind of gives you an idea. This shows you what I mean by the maps. And so this trench warfare is going to be pretty awful. There's going to be a pretty significant stalemate, for several years. And then the Americans will ultimately break that. Now, initially, Woodrow Wilson said we wouldn't get involved, but we had given a bunch of loans to Europe, and we were selling a bunch of goods. And so the U.S., is sending products over to Europe, which means that you have Britain with a blockade of Germany. Germany relies on submarines to kind of break the blockade. And what ends up happening is some American ships get sunk. And Wilson keeps claiming neutrality. He keeps getting pledges from Germany. But ultimately, Germany's going to decide it's worth risking U.S. involvement. And in 1917, they basically resume unrestricted submarine warfare. The other big factor, too, is, remember, we had been going into Mexico. We'd invaded Mexico. Germany reaches out and suggests to Mexico that they ally, or that they side with Germany, and that if they would make war against the United States, assuming that they won, they would get Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona back. So Germany is definitely kind of looking at this. I mean, in their mind, they're thinking about the way Europe functions, right? In the Franco-Prussian War, they had been fighting over Alsace and Lorraine. So basically Germany's thinking, oh, well, that doesn't matter. That territory can go back and forth. Well, that's not how America's going to see it, right? So when this Zimmerman telegram gets released, when the British actually, discover it, they get pretty upset. The Americans do. And this is going to trigger the call for war. That's a copy of the telegram. And then, of course, you have between the unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmerman telegram, you have the declaration of war. And I want to point out the irony in Wilson's statement. It is a fearful thing to lead this great peaceful people into war. Peaceful, tell that to the Filipinos. But the right is more precious than peace, and we shall fight for the things we've always carried nearest to our hearts, for democracy, for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own governments, for the rights and liberties of small nations. Again, in the context of imperialism, in the context of women's suffrage, in the context of Jim Crow segregation, that's all a pretty rich statement. And that right there should tell you that Wilson has some consistency problems. And so that's kind of how we get involved in World War I. Now, the reason why it matters for women is that World War I is this moment where where American women First off, they serve in the military. Now they're not an official part of the military. They're what they call an auxiliary corps, which kind of like the Rough Riders were in the Spanish American War. But they follow some of the same kind of guidelines, and they're very active. They're nurses. They're part of map readers, all this kind of stuff. So women have a much greater role in World War I than they've ever had in any other conflict. It's not that women weren't involved in other conflicts, but it was always very much on the home front, very much domestically, right? In World War I, you actually have women fighting, not fighting, but going overseas and participating in that sense, putting themselves in danger and beginning to follow those kinds of things. And this is all happening in the context of, raising an army. We had after the Spanish American War, as we kind of moved away from once we got everything we wanted, right? We had all these little islands. We had kind of stopped building up our military. And so what you have is the Selective Service Act of 1917, where they start drafting a bunch of soldiers, and you have African Americans serving. This is part of their we should be equal kind of thing. You have all kinds of different ethnicities working or fighting in World War I, as well as women, and you can see lots of propaganda. The other thing that women are a big part of is the effort at home. Big things like controlling the economy, administrations to control transportation and rates, food administration to balance production. One of the things that's going to be a big impact when we get to the Great Depression is that during World War I, the Food Administration encourages farmers to produce. Go out and get more land, get more tractors, all this kind of stuff. So we're producing a lot of food. There's lots of effort at conserving. So they have these meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays and all this kind of stuff, trying to encourage people to save resources for the men that are going to fight. And it's not just our men, right? We're basically feeding Britain and France by this point. By the time you get to 1917, Britain and France are really kind of struggling. And so we're supplying a lot of their needs. You also have Liberty and Victory bonds where people buy bonds and then they hold on to them for a period of time. And all of this is meant to supplement the cost of the war. This is within the context of the income tax, all that kind of stuff. And so women are very important to kind of this volunteerism. And you had women doing all kinds of things, at home, even if they weren't serving in an auxiliary corps or working for the Red Cross, they were, darning socks and they were sending care packages. And it was just a huge total war kind of concept here at home. And women were a big part of that. Women also worked in the factories. In fact, this is one of the things, so it becomes very hard to deny women the right to vote when you have so many women that have jobs. And these women have jobs and they're paying taxes and they're buying victory bonds and their sons and husbands and fathers are off at war. And so these women are making this artillery, they're doing all this. And, and because they're contributing to this war effort, it's just really impossible for Wilson to keep denying women the right to have that vote, right? So World War I is crucial because of women's participation, because women really embrace this idea that we have to work together, we have to pull together, that total war concept. And so the women don't stay in the factories, not in the numbers. I mean, you always have working women. But as far as the women that are doing the war jobs, those won't be permanent, but it definitely kind of changes the calculus for women's suffrage. And just lots of effort on, like production and that kind of thing. Also happening is the Great Migration. African Americans fed up with what is essentially the Jim Crow segregation and the lynching that was happening. And so African Americans start moving north. And so you have Mexican and Mexican Americans who were recently escaping the Mexican Revolution. They're moving north. So you have kind of this general movement northward, Mexicans to kind of the southern part of the United States, and then African Americans coming into the cities in order to find jobs primarily. But for African Americans, it's also about escaping the South. And this does create some racial tensions in the North. The North is no bastion of equal rights. They tended to think of racism as a Southern problem rather than seeing it as an American problem. But so there's going to be some resentment, some tension over housing and jobs up north. But generally speaking, this Great Migration is pretty significant. The other thing will be the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Committee on Public Information, all ways of controlling information. So if you watch the Iron Jawed Angels movie, one of the things that it points out is that they had to use Wilson's own words, right? So Alice Paul, the National Women's Party, when they're protesting him, they have to be careful because they could be accused of violating the Sedition Act or the Espionage Act. And so one of the things that makes their protest so particularly unique is that they are actually quoting the president. They're not, the way they protest is pretty clever in a lot of ways, challenging, not, pushing the line and protesting, but not crossing and violating the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Now, these acts are primarily targeted towards socialists and unions. You've got the International Workers' World, or the Wobblies. They were very critical of the war. They kind of blamed it as being capitalistic and imperialistic, and so they said, we shouldn't be doing this. And so they really kind of, were complaining. They were sending out pamphlets telling people not to register for the draft. And so a lot of them get in trouble, and you start having them being particularly targeted. This will be especially true after the war's over, right? Once you have peace. And part of this is because the Russian Revolution happens also in 1917. And so this concern about what was going on in Russia causes Americans to feel very nervous about socialism and these threats. And you did have some pipe bombs. And so you had some socialists and some anarchists that set off some explosions. And basically the country overreacts to that, surprise, surprise, and starts targeting pretty much any organization that seems to be remotely connected to any kind of unionization or socialism. The Red Scare won't last long. It'll only last about a year or 18 months. But it is pretty significant. You'll see the Sacco and Vanzetti trial will be kind of a big deal there. So technology, you can kind of see this. You had a stalemate by 1917. This is why the U.S. coming in is such a big deal. The Russian Revolution. Lots of technology. I'm not really going to go into that too much. American troops are pretty much held back until 1918. And then when they're allowed to come in for the Battle of the Argonne, the Battle of the Somme, the Battle of the Marne, they kick butt, right? And that changes the war. And so this is how you end up kind of getting the war to come to an end. So 1918, the U.S. troops are making significant gains. Also coming out in early 1918 is Wilson's 14 points. Promising kind of a peace without victory that makes Germany think this is a good way to end the thing. You also have a global pandemic with the Spanish flu. It impacts a lot of young people, particularly, and so it affects the United States, affects Europe. So you have that taking place. Ultimately, the 14 points were about, having a League of Nations, about not blaming anybody, having free trade. We're going to disarm, freedom of the seas, all these kinds of things. And so Germany, who's, pretty tired of fighting, and they've, with the U.S., entering the war and fighting, they're having a hard time. So you have an armistice, a ceasefire on the 11th day of the 11th hour, or 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, right? So that's what we now celebrate as Veterans Day. And so you have the armistice taking place. Then you have, after the armistice, a plan for a Paris Peace Conference. This is where you're going to get the Treaty of Versailles. Now, the Treaty of Versailles ignores the 14 points, with the exception of the League of Nations. And what you have is basically, Germany and Austria-Hungary lose a bunch of territory. Of course, Germany, France, and Italy do not. Neither does the United States. You have Germany being saddled with a bunch of reparation payments. And it's really a very, they forced to demilitarize, very kind of harsh treaty. And so this is going to create some real problems later on, right? This is going to be a major factor in kind of the cause for World War II. And so again, you do have some new countries created. We do have the League of Nations, but most of the ideas that Wilson had come up with in his 14 points get ignored. And so you have the war being over. These cartoons show you right here, the burden of the reparation papers, the French kind of sucking the life out of Germany. The peace table, it's all prickly stuff, very uncomfortable. So the idea was that basically that Germany was forced to accept these terms. Particularly by Britain and France. And really the Paris Peace Conference is notable because you have Japan feels pretty insulted by this. Their imperial interests were ignored, and they felt pretty insulted. You have Vietnam there who wants to advocate. They believe that Wilson's idea of we're going to end all this colonialism. They think, oh, good, that means we're going to, the French are going to leave Vietnam. So Ho Chi Minh, right, his first experience with the United States goes back to the Paris Peace Conference. So lots of ways in which this treaty definitely kind of filters through American history. Now, the U.S. will reject the treaty in part because the League of Nations concerns a lot of senators. They're concerned that this international organization will dictate U.S. involvement. So the Senate rejects the Treaty of Versailles. And basically, there's kind of this attitude that we don't want to be involved in global affairs anymore. And so we don't want to be sucked into these conflicts, right? And so that's how you're going to end up with us not signing that. We're going to have a series of separate treaties to end the war. Wilson, trying to get support for the treaty, travels around the country, but has a stroke, right? In fact, there's some indication that his wife basically ran the country for the last year. So kind of thought that was a little bit interesting. I'm going to see if I can't find a video on that one. And this kind of shows you some cartoons about the treaty, the concern that it's going to tie our hands, the Senate stopping it, this idea that the U.S., that the world order is not going to be completed because the U.S. refuses to participate, and that there's no way that, that the League of Nations is going to be able to do anything. So that kind of takes you through World War I. Again, global context, you had the Panama Canal finished about 1914. So this is a big part of how the U.S. is able to send so many supplies. You have a bunch of new countries. The Russian Empire collapses with the creation of the Soviet Union and kind of that communism there, which will eventually lead to the rise of Stalin. The Middle East, much of the problems that we see in the Middle East even today have their origins in World War I. And the mandate system where they basically drew a bunch of lines in the Middle East. And so you have that being a huge problem. Britain and France had a lot of economic problems after this. They had spent so much money and lost so many men that they struggle a lot after the war. And Germany's struggling. You have massive inflation, all that kind of stuff. And Japan being pretty upset. And then the League of Nations is largely a toothless animal. They can't really do anything. This is going to be particularly true when you get to Italy invading North Africa in the 1930s, or Japan invading China in the 1930s. So we'll see that a lot of this is going to shape out into World War II. This kind of shows you the difference, right? All these different countries created. And so that's World War I in a nutshell. Again, the big thing you want to know as far as women are concerned is how women's participation in the total war concept really leads to leads to women's suffrage, leads to the 19th Amendment. And so that's probably your most important concept, and that women were such a huge part of the war effort. And that's what made the United States more likely to be successful. Globally speaking, after World War I, you begin to have kind of a different attitude towards women's rights. Women become much freer, and you have kind of the flappers and all that kind of stuff, which we'll be talking about in the 1920s. So World War I, again, you have female involvement much more so than you do with imperialism, but it is definitely a part of what's going to get us to really kind of the big story of this period, which is how women gain political participation and how women really kind of begin to redefine who they are and kind of shed some of those social controls that had been in place.